Thanks, Tony, very much. All right, please don't go anywhere. We now have a special 10-minute presentation. Most of you are probably familiar with this by now. The ad in the Australian on Friday, where the Queensland... What? No, the Queensland government promoting a modified version of the Bradfield scheme and a version of the Clarence River scheme. So this is obviously a massive political breakthrough for us, which the water crisis has forced upon them. So what we're going to do now, if you're ready, Professor. Professor Lance Endersbee, who many of you have seen on video at our conferences before, he has some back... All right, Lance has some background information on this, which he's willing to come and speak to us about. He's been in discussion. Lance, do you want to come here so you get the benefit of the...
I've been sailing.
Oh, have you?
You remember the deal? Yes, thank you.
I'll just hand over to Lance.
I was very lucky this morning. I had two granddaughters who were sailing at the Mount Martha Sailing Club in the minnows, which are tiny little boats. So each of the granddaughters had one each. And the older one, was only about that high, was sailing in the national titles for the minnows. And the other one, about that high, she was in the novice class. And as soon as I got home after lunch, there was a note from my wife saying that my son Phil would like me to go sailing with him this afternoon at Blairgowrie in his yacht. And he has recently bought a yacht from San Diego. He went through to America. He bought it over the internet, you know the way they do these things these days. And he flew to the States and he got this boat, which is a racer, a day sailor for bays like Port Phillip Bay. It's a day sailor for Chesapeake Bay. And this afternoon they had a crew of 8 1/4. I was the quarter. And it's a real excitement machine, and it's a wonderful way to spend your afternoon. We were really travelling, and it was fantastic. So there we are. I've had a good day. No, but I didn't have my customary after-race sustenance. Now, some exciting things are happening. In Australia, Howard has produced his water plan, and he's announced that Malcolm Turnbull is to manage it. But the interesting thing is that they are talking about the management of the Murray-Darling Basin is going to be put under, if you like, scientific and economic management, they say. And they're going to reallocate the waters of the Murray-Darling Basin, and they're going to do it all by fiat and market forces, and Malcolm Turnbull's the guy. Now, you must remember that a scheme like the Snowy scheme, and we've told you about the Snowy scheme, was planned and designed and built by governments. And about 8 years ago, when the Snowy scheme, when the 50-year centenary of the 50-year celebration of the start of the Snowy scheme, the celebrations for that, and I was invited to write a paper by the Institution of Engineers, and I did, and it was the Snowy vision in the first 10 years, or the Snowy team in the first 10 years. And I was politely told that things weren't done that way anymore. And basically, I had written a paper about the way governments showed leadership in planning and building for national development in Australia. And the Snowy Scheme was, if you like, the first and only national development project.
Because this microphone can pick you up.
Okay. All right. And the Snowy Scheme was the only national development project. And I wrote about that. But I was politely told that my paper wasn't wanted because things aren't done that way anymore. And then I was invited to speak to an academy function. And I was told, interestingly, to confine my attention to rock mechanics, a matter in which I'm rather an international specialist. But I was determined to write about the wonderful triumph of the young people and the government leadership that brought about the Snowy Scheme. So I prepared my paper and didn't show it to anybody, and when the time came and I was scheduled to talk about rock mechanics, I spoke about what I intended to speak about anyway. And the paper is available on the internet, and if you look up Lance Endersbee's paper in the Snowy Vision, you can read it. Now, the important thing is that governments, federal and state, don't want to go down that track in Australia. In electricity, they're privatising a lot. It's happening in water, in city water supplies, and now they're planning to do it for irrigation. The fact is that the great infrastructure of Australia, if you like, all the roads and the railways and the tramways, the public transport in the cities and the great irrigation projects and the water supply projects, the electricity projects, all of those were planned and built by governments with a view to planning and building for the future. Now, as a result of the privatisation, and you'll remember that there was even an attempt to sell the Snowy Scheme. Now, we're going to privatise the Snowy Scheme, and the people of Australia objected. And the politicians, they were very surprised. They were shocked to think that the people of Australia were adamantly opposed to the sale of the Snowy Scheme. And that indicates to you just how far out of touch they are. And they have got themselves in a position where they cannot plan at government levels in Australia. We cannot plan and build for the future anymore because governments are saying that this will be done by the private sector. And in the privatisation of all these public works, in the decade of the 90s, governments around Australia sold about $100 billion of public assets, which was cash they raised without taxation. So it's a huge amount. And of course governments like that. You know, fancy raising $100 billion without taxation, that's rather wonderful. You can spend the money and the people love you. But the net result of that is that we have lost our capacity to plan and build for the future. We're already facing problems with respect to electricity supply, and governments are making funny noises, and what they want to support wind power and things like that. But as far as planning and building for the future of electricity supply systems, virtually nothing is being done. And the same applies to water. And they're not planning and building for new water developments, and they're saying what we're going to do is to keep on charging more. We'll keep on rationing the water supply. And so in this arena, and I have proposed, and the CEC has included my ideas in some of your magazines and newspapers. I've been talking about bringing water down from the north, the sort of things we could do, inland diversion of the Clarence. And I had been pointing out that these projects are economic. Unfortunately, the federal government said that they weren't economic because they were thinking only of bringing water from the north down towards the Murray-Darling Basin. But there was no thought of using any of that water on the way down. And all the way down from, say, the Gulf of Carpentaria towards the Murray-Darling Basin, there's a range of climates, there's a range of soils. And I've been in the area and I can see that there's a whole range of new crops they can grow. And at the same time, there's a need to add the infrastructure, the road systems to go with it. And I have been in these areas and I have seen the crops that the farmers can grow. And they use, I must admit, they use artesian bore water to do it. They show me the demonstration crops they grow. And then the crop just withers on the ground because there is no way to get it to market. But they know that there's great potential up there. And so in this last problem with Howard announcing his great water plan, Peter Beattie of Queensland has said, oh, well, why don't we bring water down from the north and why won't we to have a go at bringing the Clarence scheme inland? I cheer that, but I have to mention that that is a proper job for government. These schemes would be enormous. They're of the magnitude of the Snowy scheme, and they can only be planned and built by governments. And at the present moment, the view is this would be done by the private sector. It wouldn't be. But if, by some miracle, the private sector came in, say somebody like General Electric or so on, and they came in and said, well, look, we'll develop the inland diversion of the Clarence River into the Murray-Darling Basin as a pumped storage scheme, and we'll ally it with a major new nuclear power station which would provide base load, and we'd have the pumped storage capacity, and that would mean that they could store energy at off-peak times and make it available at peak. And so you could have a wonderful combination of a nuclear power station, a pumped storage and inland diversion of water, and English Electric or General Electric and ETF in France could come along and they'd say, we'd fund and build a lot. Now governments would do handsprings. But really, that's what the government should be planning and building themselves. And I get rather worried at the prospect that we could have some pretty big operators coming along and mustering in Australia. And in my book that some of you have seen, I've talked about the water problems in China and India and so on. You can easily see that having regard to the problems in China and India, the governments of those countries could quite easily be interested in major, huge developments in Australia. Here's China with over 1 billion people and India with over 1 billion people, and we're 22 million. You could easily have a situation where China says they want to build these major projects in Australia, and don't you worry about it, they'll provide the money, that wouldn't mean anything to them. But the only requirement is that we use these projects to provide food for China. But you don't worry about the engineering, they do all the engineering, and as far as the labour is concerned, they bring in the labour we need to run the project and so on. So we'd get profoundly disturbed if that sort of thing happened. But that's where we stand at the moment, where governments, federal and state, are saying that they are not going to plan and build for the future. From now on, they are waiting for the private sector to tell them what to do. It's an enormous risk. May I just get on with one other subject in which I'm interested? I have been asked by somebody to write a paper on the global warming problem and the IPCC, the committee that has just recently released a report in Paris on global warming, and with all the forecasts about how terrible things will be in 50 years' time and 100 years' time, and the sea levels are rising and so on. When I saw that report, I issued a little note to my colleagues in the academy, and I just said to them that the global use of groundwater, which you'll see it in my first chapter of the book, the global use of groundwater has been so enormous, and particularly in China and India and America and so on. It is, at the present moment, they are trying to get about 800 cubic kilometres, just imagine 800 cubic kilometres of water is taken from underground resources of water, where that water is not replenished from surface waters, and that water becomes a net addition to the hydrosphere, which means it's a net addition to the oceans. And the people in Paris said that as a result of global warming and the use of carbon dioxide, which is causing the world to warm, as a result of this carbon dioxide problem and global warming, the sea levels were rising by 2 millimetres per year, 2 millimetres per annum. And I said that the 800 cubic kilometres that is presently being taken out in groundwater around the world is exactly 2 millimetres per annum increase. So the President of the Academy has noted that, and he sort of said to everybody, just take stock that the IPCC report, the report is the international report by the United Nations Environment Programme and all of it. The United Nations report said that we've got global warming due to carbon dioxide and the sea levels are rising. And Lance Endersbee has explained that 2 millimetres per annum is due to the extraction of groundwater. And he said we must discuss these issues. Now, when this United Nations report was issued, you remember they said there was consensus and it was the end of the debate. Okay? And it's really the first time in my professional career I have, in effect, received an injunction not to think. And it really is a disgraceful state of affairs. And at a recent Academy meeting, I said, we're getting ourselves tied up in knots with these consensus reports for government. And I reminded my colleagues that Newton and Hooke and Boyle would never have wasted their time on a consensus report for government because they were flat out arguing amongst themselves. And that's what we should be doing. And so when I'm told that there is consensus, you've got to shut up, not to think, it worries me. It worried me when the President of the Academy of Science in Australia said it was the end of the debate, we must stop arguing and get on with getting on with the job. And the President of the Institution of Engineers has said that, and I've sent him a sharp note. But the important thing is that it is an entirely new situation intellectually. It's not entirely new, it goes back to Galileo and Copernicus and all the rest of it. If you argue against the global warming issue, you're just a heretic that's got to be excommunicated or something like that. And this is a terrifying state of affairs. And so I've been asked to say a few more words about it. And I'm writing a paper on that at the moment for publication next month. And the incredible thing is that all the evidence that the United Nations Group and the World Meteorological Office and whatever, all the evidence that they have can prove something else. And the sad thing is that they started off on this campaign program 20 or 25 years ago, convinced that the use of carbon fuels, coal and oil and what have you, was causing global warming. And they've now got 20 odd years of data that they've been collecting. And I've been sieving through this and looking at some other stuff from NASA and elsewhere. And I can see that they would have some data which would glare out at them and they would say, that proves so-and-so. But they don't seem to realise that very often these correlations work in the opposite direction. And a good example is this carbon dioxide matter and warming. And they say because we're putting carbon dioxide into the air, we're causing warming of the oceans. Now, if you look at the ordinary solubility curve for carbon dioxide in water, you'll see that it just goes down with increasing temperature. It's a bit like if you boil lemonade, the bubbles come out of it. Do you get the idea? And that's what happens in the oceans. And so what's been happening is that we've been having global warming, and it's the global warming which has been driving the carbon dioxide out of the oceans and pumping it into the atmosphere. And we have to have a look at how global warming is occurring. And global warming is occurring because the electromagnetic radiation from the sun has been growing substantially during this century. And there have been centuries like it before. And there have been centuries where there's been global cooling. And just a few hundred years ago, in what they call the Maunder Minimum, the Little Ice Age, there was ice pairs on the Thames. The Thames froze over year after year for decades. The Barents Sea used to freeze over. You could go from Sweden to Finland by sleigh. And they even had hotels on the ice where you could stay overnight. So there have been there have been times of great global cooling. And also 1,000 years ago the Vikings were in Greenland. They called it Greenland because it was green. And so the Vikings, 1,000 years ago, the Vikings were able to sail to Greenland and settle there. Then it got cold and they left, and we had this cold problem in the Little Ice Age. And so there have been these times when the climate has gone up and down. And one of the things they used to use to study or try to work out the climate, and this was a good example, was Galileo. Galileo was able to look at the sun because he had a telescope, but he didn't have to look at it directly. He let it shine on a wall. And Galileo could see that the sun had spots on it. And Galileo and company, they started to count the spots. And since in fact, the Chinese knew that the sun had spots and counted, and that was 1,500 years ago. And so for the last 300 or 400 years, people have been counting the spots on the sun. And now, as a result of the work of NASA, they're finding that these are just not spots on the sun. These are dark spots because there's a great ejection of electromagnetic material, ions, it's electrons and protons and stuff, dissociated material, just being ejected from the sun. And it's at such high velocities, the area where this stuff is being ejected is cooled, adiabatic cooling sort of thing. So they're darker than the surrounding areas, and the surrounding areas are a bit whiter. But they've also found that the spots on the sun are a good indicator of the actual electromagnetic radiation of the sun. And if you go to the internet and have a look at the website on the sun and solar radiation, you find that NASA have got a little, almost like a wind vane. And every day you can just go to the NASA site and they tell you the velocity of the solar wind and the number of particles per cubic centimetre, this sort of thing. And so there's this great data and flood of data, and we now know about these sunspots. And so it's becoming pretty evident that the global warming is actually due to the sun. And it is due to changing pattern of electromagnetic radiation of the sun. Now, the trouble with that is that they don't know enough about it yet to include it in the climate models. The climate models, and they're mainly from Hadley in the British Meteorological Office, the climate models, they can model because of Arrhenius and others, they can model the carbon dioxide and what have you. So they're saying the climate models are the climate is what we can calculate. And it's rather weird because the most vital and the primary driver of global climate, they can't model in their climate models. And so we're at this stage right now. Just to finish up by saying, because of all the exhortations about what they're doing, about this global warming, you've got to take care, and there's carbon trading, and there's the banks that are sort of interested in the whole business. Well, I was on my boat with my son this afternoon. I just said to a young banker from Pete Marwick and what have you, I said, "Are you involved in this business on carbon trading?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Look, there's billions of dollars there, and you've got to remember that it's all based on the assumption that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to increase. There's a very strong possibility that we could just slip back to a climate like 1977, when everybody was convinced that there was going to be an ice age. And if we go, that's only 30 years ago, if we go back to the climate of 1977, you'll find all of a sudden that all these carbon credits, which people are attributing, and they're adding up, they make billions of dollars, I said all of a sudden they're going to be worthless. And I can tell you, the banks are going to do all right. There's going to be an awful lot of people who just lose their shirts. And the people that lose their shirts are these people who are ardent, who've been captured by the romantic and religious issue of global warming.